In the coldest winter, even the smallest spark of hope can mean everything. A man with nothing left to give, 2 children with everything to lose, and a journey that will test the very meaning of courage. This is a story about falling and finding the strength to stand again. Stay with me, because sometimes hope appears where you least expect it.
The frost clung to the bark of the dead pine like a second skin, stubborn and hard as iron. Silas brought the axe down with a sharp exhale, the crack of metal against frozen wood echoing across the empty slope. The log didn't split. The axe head merely bit into the surface, sending a violent shudder up the ash handle and straight into Silas's shoulders. He wrenched the blade free and swung again, harder this time. The wood surrendered with a sharp snap, but the victory cost him. Warm wetness seeped through the cracked leather of his right glove. Silas dropped the axe and peeled the glove back. His knuckles were raw, the blisters weeping a mixture of clear fluid and blood. He stared at his hands. They were large, bruised, and thick with dirt, but the calluses told a story of failure. They weren't the broad, leathery pads of a lifelong lumberjack or a hardened ranch hand. The thickest, oldest calluses sat squarely on the inner edge of his right thumb and the side of his index finger, the exact spots where a man would grip the heavy leather binding of a pulpit Bible, lifting it day after day for 10 years. A muffled sound drifted through the gaps in the cabin's log walls, breaking his reverie. It was a cough, wet, rattling, and deep in the chest. Silas closed his eyes, his breath pluming in the frigid air. That was Jonah. His 6-year-old son had been coughing like that for 3 days, and each spasm sounded weaker than the last. Inside that freezing one-room prison, Jonah's twin sister, Lily, was huddled under a pile of moth-eaten furs, her teeth chattering so violently Silas could hear it in the dead of night. He picked up the axe and buried it in the chopping block. He didn't need to count the remaining split logs to know the truth. The wood wouldn't last the week. The flour barrel was already scraping bottom, and they had eaten the last of the salted venison 2 days ago. Winter was going to kill his children. Silas pushed open the warped wooden door of the cabin. The air inside was barely warmer than the wind howling across the mountain. He walked past the small cot where the twins lay tangled together, refusing to look at their pale, sunken faces. He couldn't bear it. Instead, he went straight to his worn canvas coat hanging on a peg and reached into the pocket. His bruised fingers pulled out a crumpled 2-week-old newspaper clipping. He already knew the words by heart, but he read them again in the dim light. Wanted. Domestic help for homestead. Maid, cook, and wet nurse duties. Must be reliable. Modest room, board, and $5 a month. Inquire at the Ashford property 5 miles northeast of Helena. $5 a month. It was an insult. A cowboy working the line made 30. Even a greenhorn mucking out stalls made 15. But Silas was neither of those things. He was a ghost. The trap had closed around him slowly, methodically. First, the economic jaws had snapped shut. Old man Miller at the general store had cut off his credit a month ago. "I'm sorry, Reverend," Miller had muttered, not meeting his eyes. "But you ain't paid a dime since the thaw. I got my own family to feed." Then came the second jaw, his reputation. Silas had swallowed his pride 3 weeks ago and walked down into the valley, offering his broad shoulders to the foreman at the Barquet Ranch. The foreman had taken one look at him, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, and shaken his head. "I know who you are, Garrett," the foreman had sneered. "Ain't hiring no cursed preacher who let his own wife bleed out while he was busy talking to a sky that wasn't listening. You bring bad luck. Go back to your mountain." They didn't see a man willing to work. They saw a walking omen, a tragedy they didn't want tracking mud into their bunkhouses. And so Silas's own pride had become the bars of his cage. He had retreated to the high country, convincing himself he could provide, that he didn't need a world that had abandoned him. It was a lie built on ego, and now his children were paying the price. Silas crumpled the newspaper clipping in his fist. He looked back at the bed. Jonah coughed again, a weak, pitiful sound that tore straight through Silas's chest. "Get your boots on, Jonah," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Lily, wrap that heavy quilt around your shoulders." "Papa?" Lily peered out from under the furs, her dark eyes huge in her thin face. "Are we going hunting?" "No," Silas said, shrugging into his coat. He didn't look at them. If he looked at them, he would shatter. "We're going down the mountain." The 5-mile walk from the edge of Helena to the Ashford property took 4 agonizing hours. Silas carried Lily on his back the entire way, her small, feverish body shivering against his spine. Jonah walked beside him, clutching the hem of Silas's coat, his small boots dragging in the freezing mud of the rutted road. By the time the farmhouse came into view, Silas was running on nothing but desperate, hollow adrenaline. The property was isolated, set back against a stand of bare aspen trees. It wasn't a grand estate, just a sturdy, weather-beaten house with a wraparound porch and a barn that leaned slightly to the west. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a beacon of warmth that made Silas's empty stomach clench. He walked up the wooden steps, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He set Lily down gently, pulling her and Jonah close to his legs. He took off his hat, revealing dark, unkempt hair that hadn't seen shears in months, and knocked on the heavy oak door. Footsteps sounded inside. Slow, deliberate. The door opened. Silas had expected an older woman, perhaps a stern matron or a frail widow. Instead, he found himself looking down at a woman who couldn't have been more than 30. She wore a plain, dark blue dress that did nothing to hide the heavy, unmistakable swell of late-stage pregnancy. But it was her face that stopped the breath in his throat. The left side was strikingly beautiful, with high cheekbones and a piercing gray eye. The right side was a ruin of twisted, shiny, heavily scarred tissue that pulled her mouth into a permanent, slight grimace. It was a burn scar. An old one, completely healed but utterly devastating. She didn't flinch as she took in the sight of the giant, bearded man looming on her porch, smelling of wood smoke and unwashed wool. She didn't gasp or step back in fear. Her solitary good eye swept over him, then dropped to the 2 shivering children clinging to his trousers. "If you're looking for a handout, I have nothing to spare," she said. Her voice was steady, devoid of warmth or fear. Silas tightened his grip on the brim of his hat. He felt the last remnants of Reverend Silas Garrett, the respected man, the scholar, the proud husband, die right there on the porch boards. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled newspaper clipping, holding it out to her. "I ain't looking for charity, ma'am," Silas said, his voice rough. "I'm here about the job." Clara Ashford looked at the clipping, then back up at him. A flicker of something, confusion perhaps, or dark amusement, crossed her features. "You are applying for the position of a domestic maid?" "Yes, ma'am." "The job requires scrubbing floors on your hands and knees, chopping vegetables, boiling sheets in lye soap, emptying chamber pots." She listed the tasks deliberately, watching his face for the inevitable revulsion. It was women's work. To a man of the West, it was the ultimate degradation. Silas's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He felt the phantom sting of the Bible calluses on his hands. He felt Jonah shivering against his left thigh. "I can scrub," Silas said, holding her gaze. "I can cook. I'll haul your water and boil your sheets. I don't care what the work is." Clara crossed her arms over her pregnant belly. "I have no money to pay a man's wage. The advertisement said $5 a month, and I can't afford to feed a family of 3. "I don't want a man's wage," Silas replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I'll take the $5. As for the food, you feed the children. Whatever they leave on their plates, I'll eat. If they leave nothing, I go hungry. All I ask is a warm place for them to sleep." Silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute, save for the biting wind rattling the porch beams. Clara stared at him, her gray eye analyzing him. weighing the sheer, terrifying desperation radiating from his massive frame. She knew what it cost a man like him to stand here and beg to scrub her floors. Most women would have been terrified. Most women would have slammed the door and bolted it. Clara Ashford simply stepped back and pulled the door wide open. "The mudroom is in the back," she said, turning her scarred profile to him. "Leave your boots there. There's a bucket of lye water by the stove. The kitchen floor needs scrubbing before you start the supper." Silas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The trap had closed, but inside it there was warmth. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and led his children across the threshold. The floorboards of the mudroom were freezing, offering no forgiveness through the thin, woven blanket Silas had folded beneath himself. He woke before the sun, his body stiff, his joints locked in a symphony of quiet agony. Beside him on the narrow pallet they had constructed from old grain sacks and straw, Jonah and Lily were finally sleeping soundly. The rattling in Jonah's chest had softened to a raspy purr, and Lily's forehead, when Silas brushed his raw knuckles against it, was cool to the touch. The fever had broken. The harsh, meager warmth of the Ashford house had done what a week of desperate prayers on the mountain could not. Silas sat up, wincing as the muscles in his back protested. He looked down at his hands. The blisters from chopping wood had burst and sealed over with dirt, but the skin across his knuckles was cracked and peeling from the lye soap. He had spent 4 hours on his hands and knees the previous afternoon, scrubbing decades of ground-in grease and ash from Clara Ashford's kitchen floor. He was a giant of a man, standing 6'4" with shoulders built for hauling timber. Yet here he was, folding his massive frame into the shape of a domestic servant. The humiliation had burned hot in his chest yesterday, but this morning, looking at his sleeping children, the fire had cooled into a dull, heavy stone of acceptance. Silas stood, his head grazing the low ceiling of the mudroom, and quietly stepped into the kitchen. The house was completely silent, save for the wind whistling through the loose chinking in the logs. The air held a biting chill. Silas's first duty was the fire. He moved to the cast-iron stove occupying the center of the kitchen wall. It was an old, heavy beast of a thing, its black belly pitted with rust. Yesterday he had noticed it sat unevenly on the warped floorboards, causing the cooking grates to slant. He knelt beside it, his mind automatically shifting to the mechanics of the problem. A slant meant uneven heat. Uneven heat meant ruined bread, and he could not afford to waste a single ounce of the flour Clara had provisioned. Silas went to the mudroom and retrieved his father's old hunting knife, using the thick spine of the blade as a makeshift wedge. He grunted, bracing his shoulder against the iron body of the stove, and heaved. The iron groaned, lifting a fraction of an inch off the floor. Sweat broke out on his forehead as he tried to kick a small, flat sliver of kindling under the cast-iron foot. The wood snapped instantly under the crushing weight. He swore under his breath, dropping the stove. It landed with a loud, metallic clang that made him wince. "You're fighting the iron, Mr. Garrett. The iron always wins." Silas froze, still on his knees. He turned slowly. Clara Ashford stood in the doorway of the hallway leading to the bedrooms. She wore a heavy woolen shawl wrapped tightly over her nightgown, her arms cradling the swell of her belly. In the pale gray light of dawn, the scarred right side of her face was thrown into sharp relief, the puckered skin pulling her eye into a harsh slant. But it was her good eye, steely, calm, and entirely unimpressed, that pinned him to the floor. Silas slowly stood, feeling the heat rise in his neck. He quickly wiped his dirty hands on his trousers, acutely aware of how massive and out of place he looked in her kitchen. "The floor is warped, ma'am. The stove lists to the left. I was attempting to level it so the pans won't slide." "I know it lists," Clara said, her voice devoid of sleep or sympathy. She walked past him, her movements slow and deliberate, burdened by the child she carried. She didn't look at the broken kindling. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her apron, which hung on a chair nearby. She pulled out a small, smooth river stone, no bigger than a pocket watch. Without asking for his help, Clara knelt awkwardly, her breath hitching slightly as her belly pressed against her knees. She jammed the river stone squarely beneath the shortened front leg of the stove. She didn't heave or strain. She simply found the exact pivot point where the floor dipped and let the stone slide into the natural groove. She stood up, brushing a dusting of ash from her hands. Wood compresses under iron, Mr. Garrett. Stone endures. Silas stared at the stone, then at the perfectly level cooking grate. A carpenter's mind had sought a carpenter's solution. A woman's practical, everyday survival had found the answer. His jaw tightened. He had been a scholar, a preacher, a man who believed he held the answers to the cosmos, and he had just been schooled in basic mechanics by a pregnant widow with a rock. "I will start the fire, ma'am," he said, his voice flat, refusing to give her the satisfaction of an apology. Clara simply nodded, turning her ruined profile toward him. "When you are done, the washboard is in the shed. The water needs to be boiling before you begin the linens." She walked back to her bedroom, leaving him alone in the growing light. Silas spent the next hour working in absolute silence. He built the fire, the flames roaring to life and finally banishing the bone-deep cold from the room. He mixed the dough for biscuits, his large, battered hands working the flour and lard with surprising gentleness. As the dough rested, his eyes wandered back to the stove. The single river stone held the front leg perfectly steady. But Silas noticed a micro-wobble in the back right leg when he placed the heavy iron skillet on the burners. He stood there for a long moment. Then he silently walked out the back door into the freezing dawn. He scoured the frozen dirt near the well, his bare hands digging through the frost until he found 3 more flat river stones. He brought them inside, wiped them clean, and wedged them under the remaining legs of the stove. He didn't tell her. She didn't ask. But when the heavy cast-iron pot of coffee boiled later that morning, it didn't rattle. The rest of the day blurred into an agonizing symphony of manual labor. The boundary between Silas the man and Silas the maid began to dissolve in the hot, caustic steam of the wash kettle. He stood in the yard behind the house, the freezing wind biting his face while his hands plunged into boiling hot water laced with lye. He was washing Clara's clothes. The intimacy of the act felt like a physical weight. He scrubbed her heavy woolen skirts, the rough fabric tearing at his raw knuckles. Then came her undergarments, simple, worn cotton shifts. A fierce flush of shame burned Silas's face as he pinned them to the frozen line, the fabric stiffening into icy boards almost instantly. He, a former man of God, was airing a stranger's intimates in the winter wind. But as the days bled into a week, the shame began to morph into something else. Routine. There were no spoken rules in the Ashford house, only a silent choreography of survival. Clara rarely spoke to him beyond issuing brief instructions. She spent her days mending clothes, balancing a battered ledger book, and occasionally reading to Jonah and Lily, who had taken to trailing after her like quiet shadows. Silas watched them from the periphery, his hands constantly moving. He noticed things. He noticed that Clara's left hand unconsciously rubbed the small of her back when she stood at the counter for too long. He noticed that she preferred her coffee black, but left it untouched if it had gone lukewarm. He noticed the slight suppressed flinch when the wind howled too loudly against the window panes. One evening, after the children were asleep and the kitchen was spotless, Silas prepared to retreat to the mudroom. Clara had already retired to her bedroom, the door closed. Silas paused by the stove. He took a clean tin cup, filled it with fresh water from the bucket, and placed it on the small table just outside her bedroom door. He didn't knock. He didn't announce it. He just left it there, knowing the dry winter air in the house caused her to cough in the middle of the night. The next morning, the cup was empty, sitting on the edge of the kitchen sink. No words were exchanged. The following night, Silas did it again, and the night after that. It was a truce forged in water and stone. They were 2 broken creatures sharing a space, communicating through the silent, profound language of unasked-for labor. Silas was no longer just the hired help. He was the invisible current keeping the house afloat. And Clara, in her stoic, scarred silence, had stopped treating him like a desperate vagrant. They were surviving, together, yet entirely apart. But the illusion of safety was fragile, and the world outside the cabin walls was not content to let them hide. The sound of hooves crunching on frozen gravel broke the mid-morning silence like a gunshot. Silas was behind the barn, the heavy axe swinging in an easy rhythm. Chopping wood wasn't technically in his job description. Clara had hired him for domestic work, but the woodpile was dwindling and Silas couldn't stand the thought of idle hands when a fire needed feeding. He paused mid-swing, the blade hovering above a scarred pine log. He stepped out from behind the barn, the axe resting casually but firmly against his thigh. A single rider was approaching the house. The man sat tall and perfectly straight in the saddle of a magnificent chestnut gelding. He wore a heavy tailored wool coat with a fur collar that screamed of money, and a pristine gray Stetson pulled low over his eyes. But it was the glint of polished silver pinned to his chest that made the muscles in Silas's jaw tighten. A deputy's badge. Silas watched the man rein in his horse near the front porch. The rider dismounted with an easy, practiced grace, his leather boots hitting the frozen dirt with a solid thud. He tied the reins to the hitching post and turned toward the house, stripping off his fine leather gloves. He stopped when he saw Silas. The deputy's eyes were a pale, icy blue, holding a striking, unsettling resemblance to Clara's good eye. But where Clara's gaze was guarded and analytical, this man's eyes were sharp, arrogant, and entirely predatory. He looked at Silas, taking in the massive frame, the unkempt beard, the worn trousers, and the damp flour sack apron Silas had tied clumsily around his waist. A slow, knowing smile spread across the deputy's face. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," the man drawled, his voice smooth and cultured. "I heard rumors in town that my dear sister-in-law had taken in a stray. I expected a desperate spinster. I certainly didn't expect—" He gestured vaguely at Silas's apron. "A mountain man playing housemaid." Silas didn't move. He didn't tighten his grip on the axe, nor did he lower it. He simply stood like a wall of stone. "State your business." "My business is with Mrs. Ashford," the man said, stepping onto the porch. "I suggest you return to your scrubbing, boy, or whatever it is she pays you pennies to do." The front door opened before Silas could respond. Clara stood in the threshold. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving the scarred tissue on her cheek looking stark and angry. Her hand was resting protectively over her swollen stomach. "Harold," she said, her voice tight, brittle as thin ice. "Clara." Harold Ashford removed his hat, revealing impeccably groomed blonde hair. He offered a slight, mocking bow. "You're looking remarkably well, considering the squalor." His eyes flicked to the peeling paint on the porch rails. "Though I suppose anything is an improvement from living in a burnt-out husk." "What do you want?" Clara demanded, not stepping aside to let him in. Harold sighed, a long, theatrical sound of long-suffering patience. "Must we do this on the porch? It's freezing, Clara, and your hired help is glaring at me with an axe." Clara didn't look at Silas. "Say what you came to say, Harold. You aren't coming inside." The polite veneer on Harold's face vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hardness. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded sheaf of heavy parchment paper sealed with red wax. He didn't hand it to her. He merely tapped it against his gloved palm. "I came to deliver a courtesy, Clara. The family feels you have been left to your own devices for long enough." Harold's voice carried across the freezing yard, sharp and deliberate. "My brother has been dead for 6 months. You are carrying the sole heir to the Ashford name, and you are living in a rotting shack miles from town, relying on a vagabond who wears an apron to keep your fires lit." "I am surviving just fine," Clara said, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the doorframe. "Surviving is not thriving, Clara," Harold retorted, stepping one pace closer. And frankly, Dr. Eris agrees with me. I spent the morning with him. He signed a formal affidavit, which I have right here, stating that your physical and mental state following the unfortunate fire leaves you entirely unfit to raise a child. Silas felt a cold spike of dread drive itself into his stomach. This wasn't a drunken threat. This wasn't a thug trying to intimidate a widow. This was the law. This was money, power, and cold, hard logic bearing down on them. Dr. Aris hasn't seen me in 5 months, Clara hissed, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. He knows nothing of my state. He knows you refused to leave this property. He knows you fired the nurse the family sent. He knows you bear severe psychological trauma from the flames. Harold's eyes drifted to her scarred cheek, lingering there with intentional cruelty. Look at yourself, Clara. You hide in the woods like a wounded animal. You hire a disgraced, cursed preacher. Oh yes, Mr. Garrett, I know exactly who you are and why you ran up that mountain to wash your unmentionables. You are not well. Harold tapped the papers against his hand again. The Ashford estate cannot allow its heir to be born in the dirt and raised by a madwoman and a coward. When that baby comes, Clara, I am returning with the sheriff and a judge's order. The child will be taken to Helena to be raised in a proper Christian home, the Ashford home. You will not touch my child, Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper. Marcus is dead. You have no right. I have every right, Harold said softly. I am the child's uncle. I have the wealth, the standing, and the law on my side. What do you have, Clara? An axe-wielding maid? Harold turned his back on her, dismissing her entirely. He walked down the steps, pausing briefly beside Silas. You should pack up your brats and head back to the snow line, Garrett, Harold murmured, his icy blue eyes meeting Silas's dark ones. Before you get dragged into a legal battle that will end with you in a cell. She's a sinking ship. She's broken in the head. Don't let her drag you down to the bottom. Harold mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode away, the rhythmic thud of the hooves fading into the winter wind. Silas stood frozen in the yard. The silence that rushed back in to fill the void left by Harold's departure was deafening. He turned slowly to look at Clara. She was still standing in the doorway, her good eye fixed on the empty road. She looked impossibly small, frail, and utterly alone. But it wasn't pity that gripped Silas's chest. It was a profound, nauseating doubt. The poison Harold had dripped into the air was taking root. Silas looked at the peeling paint of the cabin. He looked at his own blistered hands, holding an axe he didn't own, wearing a flour sack as an apron. What do you have, Clara? Harold had asked. The terrifying truth was, Harold was right. Clara was isolated. She was deeply traumatized, bearing the horrific physical evidence of her late husband's madness on her own face. And who was Silas to protect her? He was a man who couldn't even save his own wife, a man who had hidden from the world for 4 years. How could he possibly stand against a wealthy, legally appointed deputy with the entire town behind him? He was a maid. He was a broken preacher. He was nothing. Silas took a step toward the porch. Mrs. Ashford, he began, his voice rough. Clara held up a hand, silencing him instantly. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Finish the wood, Mr. Garrett, she said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. Then the floors need sweeping. She stepped back inside and closed the door, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoing like a judge's gavel across the empty yard. Silas was left standing in the cold, the axe heavy in his hand, wondering if he was helping a victim or enabling a tragedy. The root cellar smelled of damp earth, sprouting onions, and slow decay. It was a miserable windowless hole dug beneath the kitchen floor, accessible only by a heavy trapdoor that Silas had propped open to let in a sliver of pale winter light. He was down on his knees again, the cold dirt seeping through the knees of his trousers. Clara had instructed him to sort the remaining potatoes, separating the rotting ones before the blight could spread to their dwindling winter stock. It was tedious, filthy work. The stench of a liquefied potato was something that clung to a man's hands for days, no matter how much lye soap he used. Silas methodically tossed the ruined tubers into a wooden bucket, his mind churning violently. 3 days had passed since Harold Ashford's visit. 3 days of an suffocating electric silence between Silas and Clara. She hadn't mentioned the deputy's threats. She hadn't spoken of the accusations against her sanity or the impending legal theft of her child. She merely retreated further into her stoic shell, her face a mask of scarred marble, her orders to Silas becoming shorter, sharper. Silas reached into the back of the earthen bin, his fingers scraping against the dirt wall. He expected to find another soft, rotting potato. Instead, his knuckles struck something hard. Metal. He paused. He cleared away the loose dirt and withered potato skins, revealing the corner of a heavy iron lockbox recessed into a hollow in the earth. It was caked in grime, clearly hidden with intent. Silas stared at it. It wasn't his property. He was a hired maid, a man paid $5 a month to scrub and haul, not to pry into his employer's secrets. He should cover it up. But Harold's mocking voice echoed in the damp cellar. She hides in the woods like a wounded animal. Silas gripped the iron handle and pulled. The box was startlingly heavy. He dragged it out of the niche and rested it on his thighs. The brass padlock on the front was unlatched, hanging loose, the haste of a woman who had needed quick access and never bothered to secure it again. Silas hesitated for only a fraction of a second before he flipped the heavy iron lid back. The pale light from the trapdoor above fell onto the contents, and all the breath rushed out of Silas's lungs. Money. Not coins. Not the crumpled single dollars a ranch hand kept in his boot. Thick, tight bundles of United States Treasury notes. 50s. Hundreds. They were stacked with a meticulous, terrifying neatness. Silas's hands trembled as he reached out and touched the crisp paper. He didn't need to count every bill to know what he was looking at. He had handled the church's building fund years ago. He knew the volume of wealth. There was easily $8,000 in this box, maybe more. A sum so astronomical it could buy a massive cattle ranch outright, or secure a suite in the finest hotel in San Francisco for years. Clara Ashford wasn't a destitute widow clinging to a rotting cabin out of necessity. She was sitting on a fortune. Silas felt a hot spike of anger pierce his chest. $5 a month. She had watched him swallow his pride, watched him scrub her floors on bleeding knees to feed his starving children, all while she had a king's ransom buried beneath the potatoes. Why? What sick game was she playing? He dug deeper into the box, his large hands shoving the bundles of cash aside. Beneath the money lay a thick manila envelope. Silas pulled it out, untying the string closure. It was a property deed. He unfolded the heavy parchment, his eyes scanning the legal jargon, the county stamps, and the surveyor's coordinates. It documented the purchase of this exact plot of land, 80 acres, bought in cash 6 months ago by one Clara Ashford. But it was the geographical description that made Silas's blood run cold. Bounded on the north by the bend of the Bitterroot Creek, extending south to the perimeter of the scorched foundation of the First Parish Church of the Valley. The paper slipped from Silas's fingers, fluttering to the dirt floor. He knew this land. He knew the bend of that creek. He knew the scorched foundation because he was the one who had watched it burn to the ground 3 years ago, a mysterious fire that took the empty church he had abandoned. This cabin didn't just sit on random acreage. It sat on the exact footprint of his former life. And less than 200 yards from where he currently knelt, hidden behind a thicket of wild blackberry bushes that Clara forbade the children to play near, was a small wrought iron fence enclosing a single grave. Margaret's grave. She knew. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Clara hadn't hired a random drifter. She hadn't looked at his massive frame and seen a desperate maid. She had known exactly who Silas Garrett was when he walked onto her porch. She had bought the land holding his dead wife's bones, buried a fortune beneath the floorboards, and then waited for the winter to drive him down the mountain straight to her door. Silas stood up, his head cracking against the low ceiling beams of the cellar. He barely felt the pain. He looked down at the box. He could take it. He could take the money, pack up Jonah and Lily, and disappear into the night. He could buy them a real house, real medicine, a future. Clara had manipulated him. She deserved to be robbed. He reached down, his hands hovering over the stacks of bills. He saw Clara's scarred face in his mind. He remembered the river stone she had quietly placed under the stove. He remembered how she read to Jonah without flinching at his cough. "She's a sinking ship," Harold had said. But this money wasn't a life raft. It was a war chest. She wasn't hiding from Harold because she was poor. She was hiding because she was planning something, and she had deliberately pulled Silas into the crossfire. Silas slowly pulled his hands back. He folded the deed, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it beneath the money. He closed the iron lid, shoved the box deep into the earthen niche, and piled the rotting potatoes back over the hole, burying the secret once more. When Silas emerged from the cellar, covered in dirt and smelling of rot, Clara was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of thin stew. She didn't look at him. "The potatoes?" she asked. "Sorted," Silas said. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, deep, gravelly, and vibrating with an unspoken challenge. He walked to the sink and began pumping freezing water over his hands. He watched her reflection in the dark, frosted window pane. She was a woman of immense wealth, bearing the child of a wealthy dead abuser, living in intentional squalor on the graveyard of his past. "Who are you, Clara Ashford?" he thought, watching her scarred profile. "And what exactly are you buying with my pride?" Silas didn't confront her. The twist of her deception wrapped around his throat, but he swallowed it down. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the desperate vagabond grateful for crumbs. He was a man holding a lit match in a powder keg, choosing for now not to strike it. He dried his hands, took the wooden spoon from her grip without asking, and began to stir the stew himself. The silence between them was no longer a truce. It was a battlefield. The storm did not arrive with a warning. It struck the valley like a descending fist. By nightfall, the wind was screaming around the eaves of the cabin, tearing at the roof shingles and driving snow horizontally against the windows with the sound of thrown gravel. The temperature plummeted so fast that ice began to crystallize on the inside of the glass. They were entirely cut off. The road to Helena was gone, buried under 3 feet of drifting snow. And no doctor, no deputy, and no savior was going to make it up the ridge. Silas had moved Jonah and Lily from the freezing mudroom into the kitchen, making them a bed on the floor as close to the cast-iron stove as he dared. He sat in a hard-backed wooden chair, keeping a vigil over the fire, feeding it log by precious log. The silence inside the house was broken only by the roar of the wind. Clara had retired to her room hours ago. Just past midnight, a sound cut through the storm. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, guttural moan, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Silas was out of his chair instantly. He crossed the kitchen and pushed open Clara's bedroom door. The room was freezing, lit only by a single, guttering oil lamp. Clara was on her hands and knees in the center of the bed, her fingers twisted violently into the quilt. Her head was bowed, her entire body rigid as a contraction ripped through her. "Mrs. Ashford," Silas said, stepping forward. She gasped, her head snapping up. In the flickering light, her face was completely bloodless, the scarred tissue taut and shining with sweat. It's too early," she panted, her voice cracking. "A month. It's a month too early." Another wave hit her. She didn't scream, but a choked, animalistic sound tore from her throat. She collapsed onto her side, curling into a tight ball. Panic, cold and sharp as a butcher's blade, slid into Silas's chest. The walls of the cabin seemed to dissolve, replaced by the memory of another room, another night, 4 years ago. He smelled the coppery stench of Margaret's blood. He heard his own useless prayers echoing as he watched the life drain out of the woman he loved. "Not again," his mind screamed. "I can't do this again." He took a step backward, his massive frame hitting the door jamb. He wanted to run. He wanted to flee into the blizzard and let the snow bury him so he wouldn't have to watch another woman die because he couldn't save her. Clara looked up at him. Her good eye wasn't pleading, it was terrified. She saw his panic. She saw the ghost of the man who had abandoned his faith. "Silas," she gasped out, using his first name for the first time. It wasn't a request. It was an anchor thrown to a drowning man. "Help me!" The sound of his name snapped the nightmare in half. Silas blinked, the memory of Margaret fading into the harsh, desperate reality of Clara. He was not a helpless preacher anymore. He was a man with calloused hands and a back broad enough to carry the weight. "I need to boil water," Silas said, his voice dropping into a calm, authoritative bass he hadn't used in years. "I need clean sheets. Don't push yet. Breathe through it." He turned and strode into the kitchen. He worked with ruthless efficiency, shaking Jonah awake. "Take your sister. Go to the mudroom. Wrap yourselves in every blanket you can find, and do not come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me, Jonah?" The boy saw the bloodless terror on his father's face and nodded, dragging a sleepy Lily away. For the next 4 hours, the cabin became a crucible of agony. There was no modesty, no romance, no gentle holding of hands. It was brutal, primal labor. Silas stripped off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. He brought basin after basin of scalding water into the freezing room. When Clara could no longer bear to lie down, Silas climbed onto the bed behind her, letting her lean her entire back against his broad chest. He hooked his massive arms under hers, physically supporting her weight as her body tried to tear itself apart. She screamed. It wasn't a delicate cry. It was a raw, tearing shriek that vibrated against Silas's breastbone. She cursed the pain, she cursed the cold, and in the darkest hour of the night, in a voice shredded by agony, she cursed Marcus Ashford. "I don't want it," she sobbed wildly, her head thrashing against Silas's shoulder. "It's his! It's going to be a monster like him! Let me die, Silas! Just let me die!" "No!" Silas roared back, his voice cutting through her panic like thunder. He gripped her tighter, pressing his bearded cheek against the sweat-soaked hair at her temple. "You are not dying. This is your child, not his, yours. You're going to push this child into the world, Clara. Do you hear me? Push!" The sheer physical force of his command seemed to ground her. She bore down, her fingernails biting deep into the flesh of Silas's forearms, drawing blood. He didn't flinch. He absorbed her pain, becoming a physical brace against the tearing of her body. "It's crowning," Silas said, shifting his position to the foot of the bed. His hands, massive and scarred from the axe and the lie, were stained with her blood. He didn't shake. He moved with a terrifying, absolute focus. "One more, Clara. One more, and it's over." With a final, earth-shattering scream that drowned out the howling blizzard, the child slid into Silas's waiting, blood-slicked hands. It was a boy. He was tiny, blue, and utterly silent. The cabin fell into a sudden, suffocating stillness. The wind seemed to hold its breath. "Why isn't he crying?" Clara whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. She tried to sit up, her good eye wide with fresh horror. "Silas, why isn't he crying?" Silas didn't answer. He laid the infant quickly on the sheet. He cleared the tiny mouth with his finger, rubbing the small, fragile chest with a rough cloth. "Breathe," he commanded silently to the universe he no longer prayed to. "Damn you, let him breathe." He flipped the baby onto his stomach, rubbing his back vigorously. Nothing. Clara let out a low, keen wail of pure despair. Silas refused to accept it. He rubbed harder, the friction burning his own hands. And then a tiny shudder ran through the infant's body, a gasp, and then a furious, reedy, magnificent wail pierced the freezing air. Color flooded into the baby's skin. Silas sagged forward, his forehead resting on the blood-stained mattress. He quickly clamped and cut the cord with his sterilized hunting knife, wrapped the squalling infant in a warm flannel sheet, and turned to the bed. He laid the bundle onto Clara's chest. Clara stared down at the red, wrinkled face. The hatred and fear she had shouted hours ago vanished, washed away by the sheer, overwhelming reality of life. She pulled the baby close to her chin, her tears mixing with the sweat on her face. "Samuel," she whispered, her ruined cheek resting against the baby's head. "His name is Samuel." Silas backed away from the bed. He moved mechanically. He removed the soiled linens, wiped down the floor, and stoked the fire in the bedroom hearth until the room was stiflingly hot. He worked until there was nothing left to do. Then he retreated to the far corner of the room, sinking down onto the hard floorboards, his back against the log wall. He looked at his hands. They were coated in dried blood. Not Margaret's blood, Clara's blood. The blood of new life. The adrenaline that had kept him upright for 5 hours suddenly evaporated, leaving a hollow, agonizing void in its wake. The dam he had built inside his chest 4 years ago. The wall of stone and pride and silent suffering cracked. Silas pulled his knees to his chest, buried his face in his bloody, calloused hands, and began to weep. He didn't sob quietly. His massive shoulders shook with violent, racking tremors. He cried for Margaret. He cried for the 4 years he had stolen from his twins. He cried from the sheer, terrifying exhaustion of holding back death for one single night. From the bed, Clara watched him. She didn't speak. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She held her newborn son with one arm, and with the other, she reached out over the edge of the mattress, extending her hand toward the corner where the giant man was falling apart. Silas felt the brush of her fingertips against his hair. He didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch, a broken man seeking the only anchor left in the storm. In the stifling, blood-scented air of the cabin, the maid and the widow forged a bond that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with survival. The blizzard broke on the 3rd day, leaving behind a world buried in blinding, silent white. The sudden cessation of the wind made the cabin feel unnervingly quiet, save for the rhythmic, damp drip of melting snow from the eaves and the occasional soft, reedy cry of the newborn. Silas stood at the kitchen window, watching the slow, agonizing thaw. He felt entirely hollowed out. The adrenaline of the birth had burned away, leaving a crushing, bone-deep exhaustion. His hands were scrubbed clean of blood, but he could still feel the phantom warmth of it drying tight against his skin. He had spent the last 2 days moving like a machine. He chopped wood, boiled water, fed Jonah and Lily, and silently tended to Clara. She had survived. The child, Samuel, was remarkably strong for coming a month early, nursing with a fierce, desperate hunger. But the air in the cabin was poisoned. The physical crisis had passed, leaving room for the truth to expand and suffocate them both. Silas hadn't mentioned the lockbox in the root cellar. He hadn't mentioned the deed, but the knowledge sat between them like a loaded gun on the kitchen table. That evening, after the twins were asleep in the mudroom and Samuel was finally settled in the wooden crate Silas had hastily converted into a cradle, the silence shattered. Silas was sitting by the stove, sharpening his axe with a whetstone. The harsh shh of steel against stone was the only sound. "You didn't ask about the money." Silas stopped the whetstone mid-stroke. He didn't look up. Clara was sitting in the rocking chair near the hearth, wrapped in a heavy quilt. She looked fragile, her face pale and drawn, but her good eye was fixed on him with unnerving clarity. "It's not my money, ma'am," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He resumed sharpening the axe. "Shh, shh. You had dirt ground into the knees of your trousers 3 days ago," Clara continued, her voice steady. "The day you sorted the potatoes. You didn't wipe them off before you came up from the cellar, and the padlock on the box was shifted." Silas set the whetstone down on the table. The sharp clack of the stone against wood echoed in the small room. He finally turned to look at her, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow across the floorboards. "I saw the money," Silas admitted, his tone flat, devoid of apology. "And I read the deed." Clara's jaw tightened. She pulled the quilt closer around her shoulders. Then you know. I know that you are sitting on $8,000. I know you could afford to hire a dozen men to protect you from Harold Ashford. And I know... Silas's voice dropped, vibrating with a tightly coiled rage. I know that you bought the exact plot of land where my wife is buried. You bought my graveyard, Mrs. Ashford, and then you waited for me to starve enough to come down here and scrub your floors. Clara didn't flinch. She met his furious gaze with a cold, desperate pragmatism. I didn't wait for you to starve, Silas. I prayed you would answer the advertisement, but I didn't force you. Why? Silas demanded, standing up. He seemed to consume all the oxygen in the room. Why play this game? Why hire a disgraced preacher for $5 a month when you have a king's ransom buried in the dirt? Because a rich widow is a target, Clara fired back, her voice cracking with the effort. She pushed herself up slightly in the chair. If Harold knew I had Marcus's hidden cash reserves, he wouldn't just take my baby. He would have me committed to an asylum or quietly killed. I needed to disappear. I needed to live in squalor so the Ashford family would think I was exactly what they wanted me to be, broken and helpless. And where do I fit into that? I needed a ghost, Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I asked around town. I asked who lived on the ridge. They told me about the mad preacher, the man who let his wife die, the man the whole town spat on and ignored. You were invisible, Silas. No one was going to come up here to check on you. No one was going to ask questions if you lived here. You were the only man desperate enough to stay, and broken enough not to judge me. Silas stared at her. The sheer, calculating brilliance of it was staggering. She wasn't a victim cowering in the woods. She was a general fighting a guerrilla war from a rotting cabin, and he was nothing but a pawn she had moved onto the board. You think you know me, Silas said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. You think because I let my wife bleed out while I prayed, that makes me a harmless, broken dog you can keep on the porch. You saved my life 2 nights ago, Clara said, her eye pleading now. You saved my son. You are a good man, Silas. A good man carrying too much grief. I am not a good man. The words tore out of Silas's throat like rusted nails. He took a step toward her, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. You want the truth, Clara? You want to know what kind of monster you invited into your house? Clara shrank back slightly, unnerved by the sudden raw violence in his eyes. 4 years ago, Silas began, his chest heaving, I lost my faith. But 6 months ago, I lost my soul. He paced to the frosted window, staring out at the black, frozen night, unable to look at her as he spoke the words he had never breathed to another living soul. I was at the Bitterroot mine the day Marcus died. I had gone down to trade some furs. I was walking behind the main shaft when I heard him. He was drunk. He was sitting on a crate with the foreman, laughing. Silas closed his eyes, the memory rushing back with sickening clarity. He was laughing about you, Clara. He was bragging about how he held the lantern to your face. He called it teaching a mare to obey. Silas heard Clara draw in a sharp, ragged breath. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The poison was finally draining. I stood in the shadows. I watched him walk toward the edge of the open shaft to relieve himself. He was stumbling. And then the timber gave way. Silas turned around. He looked directly at the scarred right side of Clara's face. He didn't fall all the way. Not at first. He caught the edge of the boarding. He was hanging there over a 50-foot drop. He screamed for help. He looked right at me, Clara. He saw me standing there. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. I was 10 feet away, Silas whispered. I had the reach. I had the strength. I could have pulled him up in 3 seconds. He begged me. He begged God. What did you do? Clara's voice was barely a thread of sound. I looked at him, Silas said, his voice dead, devoid of all humanity. I looked at his hands, the hands he used to burn your face, and I put my hands in my pockets, and I watched him hang there for 40 seconds until his fingers slipped. I listened to him hit the bottom, and then I walked away. Clara stared at him. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. Silas waited for the horror. He waited for her to scream, to call him a murderer, to point toward the door. But she didn't. Instead, Clara closed her eye, and a long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips. It wasn't a sigh of terror. It was a sigh of profound, devastating relief. "He's in hell," she whispered. "And you sent him there." Silas felt a wave of nausea crash over him. She wasn't horrified. She was grateful. In that moment, Silas looked at her and saw the terrifying truth. They were not a broken man and a victim finding solace. They were two people rotting from the inside out. She was manipulating the world with her hidden wealth, and he was a murderer by omission, wearing the skin of a righteous man. The shared darkness between them wasn't a comfort. It was a gravity well, and if he stayed, it would crush his children. "I'm leaving," Silas said abruptly. He walked past her, heading for the mudroom. "Silas, no!" Clara struggled to stand, clutching the quilt. "You can't. You have nowhere to go. The snow is melting," Silas interrupted, not turning back. "I'll pack the sled tonight. Jonah and Lily and I will be gone at first light. You have $8,000. When the road's clear, hire a Pinkerton guard, hire a lawyer. You don't need me." "I do need you," Clara cried out, her composure finally shattering. "Silas, please. The money can't protect me from Harold. He's the law. If he takes my son—" "He won't find the money if you run," Silas said, his hand on the mudroom door. He looked back at her one last time. "You were right about one thing, Mrs. Ashford. I am a coward. I ran from God, and now I'm running from you. Because if I stay in this house, I'm going to become something my children won't recognize." He opened the door and stepped into the freezing dark, leaving Clara weeping in the silence of the kitchen. The mud was thick, freezing and treacherous. It sucked at Silas's boots with every step, threatening to drag him down into the muck of the valley floor. It was just past dawn. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Behind him, Silas dragged a heavy wooden sled fashioned from broken crates and rope. On it sat Jonah and Lily, wrapped in every pelt and blanket Silas owned. They were terrifyingly quiet. They hadn't asked why they were leaving the warm house. They had seen the look on their father's face and simply obeyed, the survival instinct of mountain children kicking in. Silas's chest burned with exertion, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony in his mind. He had left her. He had walked out of the cabin without saying goodbye. He had left a woman recovering from childbirth alone in the wilderness with a newborn. He told himself he was protecting his children from the darkness of the Ashford property, but with every step he took away from the cabin, he felt like he was dragging a corpse. They were a mile down the road, approaching the bend where the dense pine forest met the open trail leading to Helena. Suddenly, Silas stopped. He held up a hand, signaling the twins to be completely still. He turned his head, straining to listen over the sound of his own ragged breathing. It was faint at first, muffled by the slush and mud, but it was growing louder. The rhythmic, heavy sound of multiple horses and the grinding crunch of iron-rimmed carriage wheels. Silas pulled the sled off the road, dragging it deep into a thicket of snow-covered spruce. "Stay down," he hissed to Jonah. "Do not make a sound." He crept back to the edge of the road, crouching behind a fallen log. A dark carriage, pulled by two massive draft horses, rounded the bend. It was flanked by 3 men on horseback. Even through the gray morning mist, Silas recognized the pristine gray Stetson and the tailored wool coat of the lead rider, Harold Ashford. Beside the carriage rode 2 men wearing the unmistakable long coats of hired muscle, their hands resting casually near the repeating rifles scabbarded to their saddles. Inside the carriage, visible through the glass window, sat an older man in a severe black suit, a magistrate or a judge. Harold wasn't making a threat anymore. He was making a surgical strike. He had brought the law, he had brought the muscle, and he had brought a carriage to take Samuel away. The storm had broken, and Harold had wasted no time. Silas watched them pass, the mud splattering from the horses' hooves. They were heading straight for the cabin. Clara was alone. She couldn't run. She couldn't fight. They would kick the door in, hand her a piece of paper, and tear the infant from her arms. And if she resisted, the hired guns would ensure she didn't survive the encounter. "It's not your fight," a voice whispered in Silas's head. "You are a murderer. You are a failed preacher. You have your own children to protect. Walk away." Silas looked back into the brush. Jonah was watching him. The boy's dark eyes, so much like Margaret's, were wide and searching. Jonah wasn't looking at a coward. He was looking at his father. Silas closed his eyes. He thought of Marcus Ashford hanging over the black abyss, begging for a salvation Silas had coldly denied him. He had chosen death then. He opened his eyes. Today, he would choose life. "Jonah," Silas said, his voice a low, urgent command. He walked back to the sled and dropped to one knee. "I need you to be a man today. You stay here with your sister. You keep her warm. I will be back. Do you understand me?" "Where are you going, Papa?" Lily whimpered, her lower lip trembling. "I have to go back and fix a broken stove," Silas lied, his voice thick with emotion. He kissed Lily's forehead, then gripped Jonah's shoulder tight. "Do not move from this spot." Silas stood up. He didn't take the heavy coat. He didn't take the supplies. He just turned and began to run. He didn't run on the muddy road. He cut through the dense, snow-choked forest, his long legs tearing through the underbrush, branches whipped against his face, drawing blood. His lungs burned as if he were inhaling shattered glass. He pushed his massive frame to the absolute limit, driven by a terrifying, singular purpose. He broke through the tree line at the edge of the Ashford property just as Harold's men were dismounting in the yard. The carriage had halted near the porch. The older man in the black suit was stepping down, holding a leather satchel. Harold drew his revolver, a casual, arrogant gesture, and walked up the wooden steps to the front door. Harold raised his booted foot to kick the door in. "Step away from my house!" The voice boomed across the yard like a clap of thunder. Harold froze, his boot suspended in the air. He turned. The hired guns whipped their rifles from their scabbards, leveling them at the tree line. Silas walked out of the shadows. He looked like a demon summoned from the earth. His clothes were torn, his face was bleeding from the branches, and his chest heaved with violent exertion. He didn't have a rifle. He didn't even have his axe. He walked straight toward the men with his bare, calloused hands at his sides. "Well, well," Harold sneered, though his pale eyes flickered with a hint of uncertainty. "The Maid returns. I thought you'd be halfway up the mountain by now, Garrett." "Put the guns away, Harold," Silas said, walking steadily across the yard. He ignored the rifles pointed at his chest. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, placing his massive body directly between the carriage and the door. "I have a court order," the older man in the suit said, his voice trembling slightly as he looked at the giant standing before him. "Signed by Judge Higgins of Helena. We are here to remove the infant from the custody of Clara Ashford on the grounds of mental instability and moral unfitness, and place it in the care of its legal guardian, Harold Ashford." "That order is invalid," Silas said. Harold laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Are you a lawyer now, Garrett, along with being a coward and a scrub woman? Step aside, or I will have my men shoot you for obstructing an officer of the law." Silas didn't move an inch. He reached into the inner pocket of his flannel shirt. The hired guns tensed, fingers tightening on their triggers, but Silas only pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. He had torn it from the back of Margaret's Bible the night before, a blank marriage registry page he had carried for years. "A widow living alone might be deemed unfit," Silas said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant cadence of a preacher delivering a sermon. A widow without means or protection can be bullied by corrupt men. He unfolded the paper and held it up, facing the magistrate. But Clara Ashford is not a widow, and she does not live alone. Harold's smirk faltered. What is that? This, Silas said, staring Harold dead in the eye, is a certificate of marriage, solemnized 2 weeks ago before God, signed by an ordained minister of the First Parish Church. Clara Ashford is my wife, and the child inside that house was born under my roof, under my legal protection. The silence in the yard was absolute. The wind whipped the paper in Silas's hand. It was a staggering, desperate lie. It was perjury. It was fraud. It was a sin that could land Silas in a territorial prison for years. He had signed his own name as the groom and his own name as the officiating minister. The magistrate stepped forward, snatching the paper from Silas's hand. He pushed his spectacles up his nose, his eyes scanning the ink. Silas had forged Clara's signature perfectly, copying it from a grocery list he had seen in the kitchen. This appears legally binding, the magistrate stammered, looking at Harold. He is an ordained minister, Harold. He has the authority to solemnize a marriage, and under the law, a married woman's children fall under the jurisdiction and protection of her husband. We cannot remove the child on the grounds of her being a solitary, unfit widow. It's a lie, Harold roared, his face flushing dark purple. He pointed his revolver directly at Silas's face. He's a drifter. He's a maid. She wouldn't marry this piece of mountain trash. Silas took a single step up the stairs, pressing his chest directly against the barrel of Harold's gun. Pull the trigger, Harold, Silas whispered, his voice dark and deadly. Shoot an unarmed man, an ordained minister, in the back in front of a magistrate. See how the Ashford name survives that. Harold's hand shook. The arrogance bled out of him, replaced by the terrifying realization that Silas was not playing a game. The giant standing before him didn't care about his own life. A man with nothing to lose was the most dangerous creature on earth. This isn't over, Harold spat, slowly lowering the gun. He snatched the paper from the magistrate. I will have this investigated. I will drag you both into court. I will prove this is a fraud. And I will see you hang, Garrett. You can try, Silas said quietly. Harold spun around, marching down the stairs. Get in the carriage, he barked at the magistrate. He mounted his horse, yanking the reins savagely. The hired guns lowered their rifles and followed suit. Silas stood frozen like a statue, watching the carriage turn around and head back down the muddy road, disappearing into the mist. Only when the sound of the wheels faded did Silas's knees give out. He slumped against the wooden railing of the porch, his chest heaving, his hands shaking violently as the adrenaline crashed. He had committed a federal crime. He had bound himself to a woman he barely knew, stepping into a war against one of the most powerful families in the territory. The front door creaked open behind him. Silas turned his head. Clara was standing in the doorway. She was clutching a heavy double-barreled shotgun, her knuckles white. She had heard everything. Her good eye was wide, bright with tears, staring at the man who had just thrown his entire life onto the fire to save hers. You came back, she whispered. Silas looked at her. He thought of the $8,000 buried in the cellar. He thought of the lie he had just told the world. He had walked down the mountain a broken maid, and he had just declared himself a husband. I'll go get my children, Silas said, his voice exhausted but perfectly steady. And then I need to level the stove again. It's still listing to the right. He pushed himself off the railing and walked back into the mud to fetch Jonah and Lily, leaving Clara standing on the porch, lowering the shotgun, knowing that for the first time in years, she did not have to fight the world alone. The heavy oak door closed behind Silas, sealing the freezing mud and the ghosts of the morning on the outside. He stood in the narrow entryway for a long moment, listening to the quiet rustle of Jonah and Lily settling back onto their pallet. They were exhausted, confused, but unharmed. When Silas finally stepped into the kitchen, the air felt dense, charged with a strange metallic tension. Clara was sitting at the scarred wooden table. She was no longer clutching the shotgun. It lay flat across the grain of the wood, its twin barrels pointed toward the wall. Beside the weapon lay the forged marriage certificate, the ink completely dry, the lie forever cemented onto the page. Silas crossed the room and sat heavily in the chair opposite her. He placed his massive dirt-stained hands flat on the table. He was waiting for the inevitable. He expected tears of gratitude or perhaps outrage at his presumption. He had legally bound her to a disgraced drifter without her consent. Instead, Clara simply slid the paper toward the center of the table. Her good eye was completely dry, calculating, and colder than the frost on the window panes. "You forge a convincing signature, Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice perfectly level. The magistrate didn't question the strokes. "I used to sign marriage registries for a living," Silas replied, his voice equally flat. "And I've seen your handwriting on the grocery lists. It was enough to pass in the cold." "It was perjury. It was fraud. If Harold presses a federal inquiry, you will hang." "Harold won't press a federal inquiry," Silas said, leaning forward slightly, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the table. "Because to do so, he would have to explain to a federal judge why a local deputy was attempting to seize an infant without a state-sanctioned warrant, using hired guns who cross county lines. He brought a local magistrate because he wanted it done fast and quiet. I made it loud and complicated." Clara stared at him. For the first time since he had met her, the stoic, impenetrable mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine, razor-sharp admiration. "You read the deed," Clara stated. It wasn't a question. "I read the deed, and I saw the $8,000 in the lockbox." Silas didn't blink. "You told me you were hiding in squalor so the Ashfords would think you were helpless. But a helpless woman doesn't buy a plot of land located precisely on the boundary line where Helena's municipal jurisdiction ends and the federal territories begin. You chose this land on purpose. Harold's badge means nothing out here. That's why he needed the magistrate. That's why he was so furious." Clara's hand moved from her lap to rest on the polished wood of the shotgun stock. "I didn't flee Marcus's estate, Silas," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "I looted it." Silas remained silent, letting her speak. The woman sitting across from him was not a victim. She was a strategist. "Marcus Ashford was not just a cruel husband," Clara continued, her eye darkening with memory. "He was the muscle behind the Ashford mining empire. He bribed surveyors. He paid men to collapse tunnels on striking workers. He ran the black ledgers while Harold wore the silver star and kept the law looking the other way. When Marcus died, the family assumed the black ledgers and the cash reserves burned in the fire that took our house." She touched the scarred right side of her face, a phantom gesture of remembrance. "But they didn't burn. I had moved them weeks before. I took the cash, I took the ledgers, and I bought this land under a fictitious corporate name, transferring it to myself just before Samuel was born. The Ashfords think I am a traumatized, disfigured widow clinging to a rotting cabin, because my mind snapped." "But your mind didn't snap," Silas said softly. "No," Clara agreed. "My mind sharpened. $8,000 is enough to hire the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. It is enough to buy a federal prosecutor out of Denver who doesn't care about the Ashford name. It is enough to systematically dismantle their entire empire, seize their minds, and ensure that my son never has to look over his shoulder for the rest of his life." Silas felt the breath leave his lungs. The sheer scale of her ambition was staggering. She wasn't trying to survive the winter, she was trying to wage a war. "But you couldn't do it alone," Silas realized aloud. "I couldn't do it if Harold seized Samuel," Clara corrected. "A mother without her child is a hostage. I needed to remain completely invisible until the spring thaw, when the federal courts convened. I needed someone to keep the fires lit, to haul the water, to do the grueling labor of survival so I could spend my nights translating Marcus's coded ledgers." She looked at Silas, her gaze traveling over his massive frame, his bruised knuckles, and his exhausted eyes. I needed a ghost, a disgraced preacher who wouldn't ask questions, who wouldn't demand a man's wage, and who was too consumed by his own misery to notice mine. Clara's voice softened slightly, losing its tactical edge. I expected a broken beast of burden, Silas. I didn't expect a man who would stand in front of a loaded gun and forge a marriage to save a woman he thought was manipulating him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of stripped-away secrets. I didn't do it just for you, Silas said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. I did it because I watched Marcus Ashford hang over that abyss, and I let him fall. I thought that made me a monster. But standing out there today, looking at Harold, I realized something. Silas reached across the table and placed his hand flat over the forged marriage certificate. I didn't kill Marcus. I just stopped saving the wicked. And I'll be damned if I let the wicked take anything else from this world. He looked directly into Clara's eyes. I am not your maid anymore, Clara. No, she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. You are not. Under the law, I am your husband. That means I have legal standing to sign documents. I have the legal right to bar Harold from this property. I have the right to stand between you and the Ashfords in a court of law. Silas withdrew his hand. You have the money. You have the ledgers, but you can't ride into Helena and fight them without a shield. They will tear a solitary woman apart. Clara's breath hitched. She saw the absolute, terrifying resolve in his eyes. The guilt that had hollowed him out for 4 years was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. He was offering her his name, his massive strength, and his life, not out of pity, but out of a shared, undeniable thirst for justice. Are you asking for a partnership, Silas? I'm stating a fact, Silas said. He stood up from the table. He didn't look like a man who had spent the morning scrubbing floors. He looked like the wrath of God. I will chop the wood. I will feed the children. But tonight you are going to pull those ledgers out of the dirt, and you are going to show me exactly how we are going to burn the Ashford Empire to the ground. Clara looked up at him. For the first time since the night of the fire, the hard, defensive lines around her mouth softened. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face, transforming her scarred features into something fierce and breathtaking. She reached out and pulled the marriage certificate toward her, folding it carefully and sliding it into the pocket of her apron. The ledgers are under the floorboards beneath the stove, Clara said simply. We have a lot of work to do. The truce lasted exactly 4 days. The winter had turned brittle, the air so cold it felt like inhaling pulverized glass. Inside the cabin, the dynamic had shifted into a seamless, hyper-focused rhythm. Silas no longer slept in the mudroom. He slept on a bedroll directly across the threshold of the front door, his father's heavy hunting knife, and Clara's double-barreled shotgun within arm's reach. During the day, they worked. Silas managed the physical survival of the homestead while Clara, sitting by the fire with Samuel nursing at her breast, decoded the dark history of the Ashford family's sins. At night, by the light of a single oil lamp, they sat shoulder to shoulder at the kitchen table, Silas reviewing her notes, his mind, trained in theology and logic, finding the legal loopholes and the vulnerable arteries in Harold's empire. They barely spoke of personal things. There were no declarations of affection, no apologies for the deception or the secrets. They were two soldiers in a trench, communicating through the silent passing of coffee cups and the shared, terrifying thrill of their impending war. It happened at 3 a.m. Silas was a light sleeper, his senses honed by years of mountain paranoia. He didn't wake to a sound. He woke to a smell. It was sharp, acrid, and completely unnatural. It wasn't the sweet, heavy scent of the pine logs in their stove. It was the harsh, chemical stench of kerosene. Silas's eyes snapped open. The cabin was pitch black, but a strange, flickering orange glow was bleeding through the gaps in the frosted window shutters. He lunged off the bedroll, grabbing the shotgun. "Clara!" he roared. He didn't need to yell twice. The bedroom door flew open. Clara was already moving, dragging a heavy woolen blanket over the cradle where Samuel slept, her good eye wide and reflecting the orange light. "The barn!" Silas shouted, peering through the crack in the shutter. The structure, located 50 yards from the cabin, was entirely engulfed in flames. The fire was eating through the dry, aged wood with terrifying speed, the flames licking 40 feet into the night sky. Worse, the wind was blowing hard from the north, carrying a blizzard of glowing red embers directly toward the dry, wooden shingles of the cabin's roof. Harold hadn't come with the law this time. He had come with fire. He was trying to burn the evidence, the mother and the maid, in one fell swoop. "The winter wood is stacked against the eastern wall of the barn," Clara yelled over the roar of the impending inferno. "If the wood catches, the flames will bridge to the house." Silas didn't hesitate. He shoved the shotgun into Clara's hands. "Stay inside. Guard the door. If anyone steps out of the tree line, you pull both triggers." "No!" Clara shoved the gun back at him, grabbing a heavy iron bucket from the sink. "I am not hiding while you die in the yard. The water pump is frozen. We have to use the snow." There was no time to argue. The survival of the children depended on the roof above their heads remaining unburnt. Silas kicked the front door open, the blistering heat of the fire washing over them like a physical wave, instantly warring with the freezing night air. The roar of the flames was deafening, a monstrous, crackling beast consuming the night. They moved with a synchronized, desperate violence. Silas didn't run toward the barn to save it. It was already lost. He ran straight for the massive cord of split firewood stacked dangerously close to the burning structure. He didn't bother trying to move the logs individually. He grabbed his heavy splitting maul and swung it horizontally, smashing into the precisely stacked wood, causing an avalanche of timber to collapse outward, breaking the bridge of fuel that led to the house. Behind him, Clara was a blur of motion. She plunged the iron bucket into a massive snowdrift, packing it full of icy powder, then sprinting toward the side of the cabin nearest the fire. She hurled the snow against the log walls, letting the intense heat melt it instantly, soaking the dry wood to prevent the embers from taking root. Silas dropped the maul and grabbed a second bucket, falling into a rhythm. Scoop, run, throw. It was a brutal, agonizing chain of labor. The heat radiating from the barn was searing, blistering the skin on Silas's exposed face, singing the edges of his beard. A massive, burning timber collapsed from the barn's roof, sending a geyser of sparks directly over them. A cluster of glowing embers landed on the dry shingles of the cabin porch. "The roof!" Clara screamed, pointing upward. Silas didn't think. He dropped his bucket, grabbed the edge of the porch railing, and vaulted himself upward, his massive arms pulling his weight onto the slanted, icy roof. The wood groaned under him. "Bucket!" he bellowed down. Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't struggle with the weight. She packed a bucket full of snow, swung it back with a guttural cry of exertion, and hurled it upward. Silas caught it perfectly by the heavy iron handle. He dumped the freezing slush directly onto the smoldering shingles, extinguishing the embers with a loud, hissing cloud of steam. He threw the empty bucket back down. She caught it seamlessly, already moving toward the snowbank to pack another. They fought the fire for an hour. They didn't speak a single word of panic. They didn't cry out in fear. Every movement was an extension of the other's will. When a section of the burning barn wall threatened to collapse toward the house, Silas leaped down from the roof, grabbed a heavy iron chain from the mudroom, hooked it around the burning support beam, and dragged it in the opposite direction by sheer brute force, his muscles screaming under the strain. Clara stood right beside him, throwing snow over his shoulders to keep his clothes from igniting. Slowly, the beast began to starve. The barn collapsed in on itself, a pile of glowing, pulsing orange ruins. The wind died down, taking the threat of the flying embers with it. The fire, having consumed its designated fuel, resigned itself to a low, smoldering burn within the foundation stones. The cabin was safe. Silas dropped the iron chain. His hands were burned, his clothes blackened with soot, his lungs burning with inhaled smoke. He collapsed onto the frozen mud of the yard, his chest heaving, his legs refusing to hold him any longer. A moment later, Clara sank to the ground beside him. Her nightgown was singed at the hem. Her face was smeared with black ash, the soot settling into the deep grooves of her scars, making her look like a warrior painted for battle. She was gasping for air, her chest rising and falling rapidly. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the freezing mud, staring at the ruins of the barn. There were no tears. There was no romantic embrace, no frantic checking of each other for wounds. The crisis had burned away every pretense, every polite boundary, and every lingering doubt. Silas turned his head slowly to look at her. In the dying orange light of the embers, he didn't see a broken widow. He saw the strongest human being he had ever known. A woman who had walked into the fire beside him without a second thought. Clara turned her head and met his gaze. Her good eye was bloodshot from the smoke, but it was fiercely, unequivocally alive. Silas reached out with his blackened, blistered hand. He didn't offer an apology for the secrets he had kept. He didn't ask for forgiveness for the man he used to be. Instead, he gently wiped a thick streak of wet ash from Clara's unscarred cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Clara didn't pull away. She leaned into his palm, her eyes fluttering closed for a fraction of a second, acknowledging the touch, accepting the weight of the man behind it. "He's scared," Silas rasped, his voice ruined by the smoke. "Harold knows the winter won't last forever. He's trying to burn us out before the road's clear." Clara opened her eyes, looking past Silas to the smoldering ruins, her jaw setting into a line of pure, unyielding granite. "Let him try," she whispered, her voice rough as sandpaper. "He just burned the only thing on this property that can't fight back." She reached down, her small, soot-stained hand finding Silas's massive, blistered fingers in the dark. She gripped his hand tightly, intertwining their fingers, locking them together in the freezing dirt. It was a silent, unbreakable vow. The marriage certificate in Clara's pocket was a forgery. But the bond forged in the ashes of the yard was as real as the blood in their veins. The maid and the widow were dead. The war had officially begun, and Silas knew with absolute certainty that they were going to win. The spring thaw did not arrive with the warmth of the sun. It arrived with the sound of breaking ice. It had been 6 weeks since the fire, 6 weeks of Silas and Clara standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for Harold Ashford's next move. But the move never came. The ashes of the barn had cooled, and the heavy winter snows had finally begun to retreat, leaving the Bitterroot Valley drenched in freezing mud. Word had reached them through Old Man Miller, who had driven a supply wagon up the treacherous road as soon as it was passable. Harold Ashford had been stripped of his badge. The federal prosecutor from Denver, summoned by a sealed letter Clara had paid Miller handsomely to post weeks prior, had arrived in Helena. Faced with Clara's coded ledgers detailing decades of bribery, extortion, and murder, the Ashford empire had crumbled from the inside out in a matter of days. Harold was facing federal prison. The war was over. Now, Silas sat at the scarred wooden table in the kitchen. There was no white dress. There was no altar, no stained glass, and no congregation to witness the vows. The kitchen still smelled faintly of old soot, and the floorboards near the mudroom were blackened from the night they fought the inferno. Between Silas and Clara lay a thick stack of legal documents drawn up by the federal prosecutor's clerk. It was the charter for the Safe Haven Trust. Every dime of the $8,000, along with the title to the 80 acres of land, was being permanently transferred into an impenetrable legal sanctuary. It was designed to build a refuge for women fleeing the kind of men Marcus and Harold Ashford had been. Clara dipped a steel-nibbed pen into a pot of black ink. Her hand, the knuckles still bearing the fading pink scars of minor burns from the fire, was perfectly steady. She signed her name at the bottom of the final page. Clara Ashford. She didn't pass the pen. She simply set it down on the table and pushed the parchment across the scarred wood. Silas looked at the paper, then at the woman sitting across from him. Her hair was tied back, her ruined cheek exposed to the soft amber light of the oil lamp. She was beautiful. Not in the soft, fragile way of parlor girls in the city, but with the fierce, terrifying beauty of a forged blade. Silas picked up the pen. He didn't hesitate. He signed his name right beside hers, his bold, heavy script interlocking with her precise letters. Silas Garrett. They weren't exchanging rings. They were exchanging their lives, binding their names to a promise that would outlast them both. Clara picked up a battered, dented tin pot from the stove. She poured 2 cups of black coffee, sliding one toward Silas. It was scalding hot and bitterly strong. Silas wrapped his massive hands around the tin, the heat seeping into his calluses. He took a sip. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Beside the stove, a large woven basket held Samuel, sleeping soundly. On the pallet near the hearth, Jonah and Lily were tangled in a pile of quilts, Jonah's head resting heavily on his father's discarded canvas coat. His breathing was deep, clear, and perfectly healthy. Clara raised her tin cup, her good eye meeting Silas's across the rim. She didn't say, "I love you." She didn't need to. "To the haven," she whispered. "To the haven," Silas replied, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet room. He drank the bitter coffee, cementing the only vow that mattered. 2 days later, the real work began. The floorboards near the front entryway had warped and splintered from the heat of the fire and the sheer volume of freezing water they had hauled through the door. Silas had taken his crowbar to them, intending to replace the damaged pine before the spring rains set in. He knelt in the dirt, his muscles protesting slightly as he pried up a stubbornly nailed plank. The wood groaned and snapped, exposing the dark, dry earth beneath the foundation joists. Silas reached down to clear away a cluster of loose rocks to level the new support beam. His fingers brushed against something cold and unnaturally smooth. He paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. He dug his fingers into the packed dirt, pulling the object free. It was a small, rusted tin box, no larger than a brick. It was sealed with a thick layer of hardened beeswax, preserving whatever lay inside from the dampness of the earth. Silas sat back on his heels, turning the heavy box over in his calloused hands. Clara stepped out of the kitchen, wiping flour from her apron. She stopped, seeing the object in his hands. "What is that? Did Marcus bury more?" "No," Silas said softly, scraping his thumbnail against the ancient wax. "This has been in the ground a lot longer than 6 months." He took his hunting knife and carefully wedged the blade under the rusted lid, popping it open. The smell of old, dry paper and dried lavender drifted into the air. Inside, wrapped tightly in a piece of oiled canvas, was a small leather journal. The leather was brittle, flaking away onto Silas's massive fingers. He opened it delicately. The ink was faded to a pale sepia, the handwriting elegant but hurried. Silas read the first page aloud, his voice dropping into a reverent hush. "October 12th, 1826. We have reached the valley. They drove us from the settlement in the east, a branded thief and a woman with the sickness. But Elias says the soil here is good. We will build our cabin by the bend in the creek. We will make our own sanctuary, where the laws of cruel men cannot reach us." Clara slowly walked over, kneeling in the dirt beside him. She looked at the faded ink, her breath catching in her throat. 1826. Exactly 50 years ago. Silas turned the fragile pages, skipping past accounts of felling trees and fighting the bitter cold, until he reached the final entry. The handwriting here was erratic, weak. February 4th, 1827. The firewood is gone. Elias broke his leg in the timber 2 weeks past, and the fever has taken him. I have wrapped him in the last of the furs. The cold is creeping through the floorboards. I know we will not see the spring thaw. I leave this record in the earth beneath the hearth we tried to build. Lord, if you have any mercy, let this land eventually hold those who need it. Let someone finish the home we could not. The journal ended there. The rest of the pages were blank. Silas stared at the brittle paper. A profound, echoing silence settled over the ruined floorboards. He looked up at Clara. Her single gray eye was shimmering with unshed tears. She reached out, her scarred fingers gently touching the faded ink of the dead woman's handwriting. They hadn't just stumbled upon a random plot of land. They hadn't just accidentally built a sanctuary. The ground beneath their feet had a memory. It had held the blood and the broken dreams of two outcasts half a century ago, waiting in the freezing dark for 50 years, until another pair of outcasts arrived to finish the job. "They didn't die for nothing," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "They claimed the ground for us." Silas carefully wrapped the journal back in the oiled canvas and placed it into the tin box. He didn't bury it again. He stood up, towering in the small space, and placed the box gently on the mantel above the cast-iron stove. "No," Silas said, his chest filling with a sudden, overwhelming sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in 4 long years. "They didn't, and we are going to finish their house." The frost clung to the bark of the dead pine like a second skin, stubborn and hard as iron. It was a bleak, overcast morning, the sky the color of a bruised slate. The wind howling down from the peaks carried the bitter, biting promise of a late spring freeze. Silas Garrett stood in the yard, his boots planted firmly in the mud. He brought the heavy, splitting maul up over his shoulder and brought it down with a sharp, controlled exhale. The crack of metal against frozen wood echoed across the empty slope. The log split perfectly down the center, the two halves falling away with a satisfying hollow thud. Silas didn't drop the axe. He didn't peel back his gloves to inspect his hands. The blisters from the lie and the winter wood chopping had long since healed, transforming into thick, unyielding calluses of thick leather. The hands of a preacher had died. The hands of a mountain man remained. He reached down, effortlessly tossing a massive chunk of split pine onto the growing pile. He swung again. Crack! He wasn't fighting the wood anymore. He wasn't punishing himself, trying to outrun the ghosts of his past or the guilt of his failures. Every swing of the axe was deliberate, powerful, and deeply grounded. He was feeding his family. He was building the haven. A sudden gust of wind swept through the yard. But this time the wind didn't carry the metallic smell of blood, or the acrid stench of kerosene, or the hollow, terrifying scent of starvation. It carried the rich, heavy, intoxicating aroma of yeast, honey, and toasted flour. Silas paused, leaning the handle of the maul against his leg. He turned his face toward the cabin. The smoke curling from the chimney was thick and white. Inside, the heavy cast-iron stove, leveled perfectly by 4 smooth river stones, was radiating heat. Through the thick log walls, a sound drifted out into the freezing morning air. It wasn't a wet, rattling cough. It was a laugh. High, bright, and utterly unburdened. Jonah was laughing at something Lily had said. A moment later, Clara's voice joined them, a soft, melodic hum as she pulled fresh bread from the oven. Silas looked at the sturdy, weather-beaten cabin. He looked at the vast, harsh expanse of the Bitterroot Valley stretching out before him. The world was still violent. The winter was still deadly. The earth was still unforgiving. But as Silas raised the axe and brought it down one last time, splitting the heartwood wide open, he felt a profound, unbreakable silence settle into the deepest part of his soul. He was not a maid. He was not a cursed preacher. He was Silas Garrett, a father, a husband, a protector of the broken. He buried the axe head into the chopping block, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked toward the house, stepping out of the cold and going home. On this channel, we share stories of the Wild West, stories of cowboys, love, motherhood, and the quiet strength of human kindness. The message of this story: even in your darkest moment, you still have the power to choose who you become. If you believe in stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, so we can keep the fire of hope alive. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or locales, is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes, and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences.
As the wind finally settles over the valley and the echoes of hardship fade into the quiet rhythm of a new beginning, we are left with something far greater than a simple story of survival. What we have witnessed is not just the journey of a broken man or a wounded woman. It is the slow, painful, and ultimately powerful transformation of two souls who refused to let the world define their ending. Silas Garrett began as a man crushed beneath the weight of guilt, pride, and failure. He believed himself to be a ghost, someone unworthy of redemption, someone who had already lost everything that mattered. And yet, when faced with the suffering of his children, and later the quiet strength of Clara, he was forced to confront a truth many of us spend our lives avoiding: that redemption is not given, it is chosen. It is forged in the moments where we decide to act, even when fear, shame, or doubt tells us to walk away. Silas did not become a better man because the world forgave him. He became a better man because he chose again and again to stand, to protect, and to take responsibility for what still remained in his hands. Clara, on the other hand, reminds us that strength does not always look like softness. Scarred, isolated, and hunted by the very people who should have protected her, she did not collapse under the weight of her trauma. Instead, she adapted, she endured, and most importantly, she planned. Her story teaches us that resilience is not just about surviving pain, it is about transforming that pain into purpose. She did not seek pity, nor did she wait to be saved. She built her own path forward, even when the world saw her as broken. And in doing so, she redefined what it means to be powerful. Together, their lives reveal a deeper truth about human connection. This was not a story of romantic fantasy or perfect love. It was something far more real, far more raw. It was about trust built in silence, about respect earned through action, and about two people choosing to stand side by side, not because they needed each other to survive, but because they made each other stronger. In a world that often divides, exploits, and judges, their bond reminds us that true partnership is not about control or dependency. It is about shared purpose, mutual respect, and the courage to face darkness together. And perhaps the most profound lesson of all lies in the idea of legacy. The land they stood on had once belonged to others, people who also fled cruelty, who also dreamed of building something safe, something meaningful. Though they did not survive to see it, their hope endured. It waited in the soil, in the silence, in the passing of time, until someone else came to finish what they had started. This reminds us that nothing we do is ever truly lost. Every act of courage, every sacrifice, every attempt to build something better leaves a mark, even if we never live to see its full impact. So what does this story leave us with? It tells us that failure is not the end. It is a beginning disguised in pain. It tells us that strength is not the absence of scars, but the willingness to keep moving forward despite them. It tells us that love is not always gentle, but it is always present in the choices we make for others. And above all, it tells us that even in the harshest, most unforgiving circumstances, there is always a chance to rebuild, to protect, and to create something that matters. In the end, Silas did not just find a home. Clara did not just win a fight. Together, they built something far greater, a place where the broken could become whole again, where the past no longer held power, and where the future, for the first time, felt possible. And maybe that is the quiet promise this story leaves with all of us. No matter how cold the world becomes, there is always a way to bring warmth back into it.